everyone. My name is Sarah Lynne Bowman from the Transformative Play Initiative at the Department of Game Design at Uppsala University. This is part 3 of our 5-part series about safety in role-playing games. And today we're going to be talking about some strategies that you can employ during the game to calibrate with other players and to signal needs for safety. So we're going to go over several different safety mechanics. And the important thing here is that you don't need to include all of these in your games. In fact, the more that you include, it can be quite overwhelming for participants to try to navigate. That being said, there are certain things that you probably should have. Like you should have a way to draw a line or a no or an X card. The X card was a tool that was developed by John Stavropoulos. And this is for tabletop. You just draw an X, put it in the middle of the table. And if content comes up, let's say clowns or spiders, just point at the X and then say spiders. So clarify exactly what it is that you're X carding. It could be things like explicit sexuality or political jokes, or it could be anything. And that just means that we're going to remove it from play. No questions asked. In LARP, you can do X arms. So you can kind of put your arms up like this and create an X. If you're on Zoom and role playing, there's actually a little X button that you can use. And there's also an O button. So like there's yeses and nos, basically, or a little check mark button. So there's ways to enthusiastically signal consent as well. So that's kind of cool that those are built-in features. So safety mechanics, as we've been discussing, are ways for people to signal to other players and facilitators their safety needs in the moment. So people may have certain needs at the beginning of a game. They may change throughout the game. Perhaps the beginning of the game, they're really scared to have any physical contact whatsoever. But by the middle of the game, maybe they feel more comfortable with that. It should be okay to adjust and to calibrate. But by the same token, if somebody says they're super comfortable with something and then halfway through the game, all of a sudden they're not, that needs to be respected and communicated as well. So that's why we have these different mechanics. One of them that is often stated, particularly in tabletop or indie LARP groups, is the door is always open. What this means is that, let's say you're running a 4-hour freeform LARP and you want to let people know that they can leave at any time without explanation. Now, this can be extremely frustrating for a game master if your game is very specifically designed for this amount of players. So you might want to have a backup plan if something like that happens. Very rarely does it happen, but sometimes it needs to happen. People have all sorts of reasons why they might need to leave. That may be safety related or may just be logistical, like they need to pick up their kids from school. With the doors always open, though, it's good to preface, you can leave without any explanation, but it would be kind if you could check in with the facilitator later and so that we can make sure you're okay. Now, you still don't have to explain yourself or anything like that, but just allowing us to make sure you're okay. Another way to do that is something we call the OK check-in, and this is something that we use in play. And it's just a question that says, are you okay? Role-playing games can be very intense. Sometimes people are crying or yelling, or maybe they're sulking in the corner, and it's hard to know if the player is feeling that way or the character. And as we were talking about earlier, there's a lot of bleed between those two things. So sometimes both the player and the character are feeling something. And strong feelings are not a bad thing. It's not something that we should be afraid of. In fact, it's things that we want to lean into because it's what makes role-playing so powerful. But it is also important to have mechanics for checking in. Now, it may be that you're in a tabletop setting and it's just normalized within that group to ask someone, are you okay? But sometimes that can feel a little bit scary for someone to answer because they're afraid of, disrupting others or being a burden to the group. So they may say that they're fine, even if they're not. So there's a more subtle way to do it with hand gestures. Again, you could also use buttons in Zoom sometimes, but you can create a signal to check in, like making an O sign in American Sign Language. And they can answer thumbs up, so I'm doing great. Thumbs down, like not doing great. Or sort of this flat wavy hand, so. And we tend to treat this flat hand as a no, meaning that if someone's not sure if they're okay, it's probably best to stop and ask them if they need some help. And the important thing here is not to get super intrusive if a person is not feeling okay. It's not to take control of their experience in any way, but rather just to offer help. Maybe they just need to verbalize something. Maybe something just upset them and they needed to get that off their chest, and then they're ready to go back in the game. Maybe they are really not doing well and they need to be led to a safety team member, like in a large scale LARP, for example. And maybe if you're willing to be that person, that's great, but maybe, you find someone else who can help them. The important thing is that they're being checked in on. And honestly, sometimes that can mean a world of difference. Sometimes just being checked in on can actually make a person feel more comfortable playing. That being said, there are a lot of situations where somebody is perfectly okay, but they look like they're in extreme distress. And sometimes it can feel really great in LARP. I know this sounds strange, but for those of you who role play, you can probably relate that there might have been times when your character was extremely upset or extremely angry, and it felt amazing as a player, which is sort of a strange dichotomous experience to be having. In that case, the thumbs up is great because it means, yes, these are good tears. Sometimes people can enthusiastically consent proactively. So they can put thumbs up or 2 thumbs up while they're crying or while they're yelling, just to say, I like this kind of play, please bring more. Similarly, people can proactively thumbs down and say, this is not so good for me. And that allows players to see that they want them to back off. And there are other ways to do that. We'll go through that in a second. So lines and veils. This has been developed within the tabletop community. A line means do not include this content. We've talked about that already. It's the same as a no or an X card. A veil means you can include this content, but please fade to black in the scene if it arises. So sexuality is a really common one. Like maybe there is a romance and sexual relationship between 2 characters, but you're not going to role play that out. It's veiled, meaning the moment that's about to happen, it goes off screen. There's also the look down or the bow out mechanic. And this is a way to signal, please don't interact with me or my character now. So there are times in play where you don't want to be having an extensive conversation about whether you're okay or not. You don't want to have to verbalize what's upsetting you, or it might not even be that you're upset. It might be that you just need to leave to go have a bio break or to, check on your kids or whatever it is. Everybody has different situations. And so that you can just put a hand over your eyes, and you can do this in a LARP, but you can also learn how to do it in tabletop. It's really a nice little gesture. If you're online, you can find a way to maybe gray out your avatar or put a filter over, just saying, I'm not available. Maybe it's turning off your screen in Zoom. It might be something as simple as that. And the idea here is, please ignore me, and follow up is not desired. So a person may put their hands over their eyes just during a scene, and that means just don't interact with me. But they could also be leaving a scene or coming into a scene. So please don't treat my characters if they just entered the scene. Don't interact with me until my hands are down. This can be super helpful when you need to slip away or slip in late or something like that. You don't want to make a big deal about it in play. Okay, so some more during the game safety mechanics. There's script change by Brebo Sheldon, and that includes things like pause, rewind, resume, fast forward. So these are ways to kind of modulate play in the moment. Again, there's stoplight, so red, yellow, and green. This can be said verbally. It's like red, like this is not okay. Or green, and that's similar to this enthusiastic consent with the thumbs up. Or it could be placed on somebody's badge. So there, maybe you have red, yellow, and green on your name badge, and then you can point at where you're at. Maybe you're at a red, and so that you're pointing at that. Similarly, you can have ribbons or buttons or some other markings. I've seen ribbons used to indicate being open to certain kinds of violence. I've seen buttons used for pronouns, the pronouns that that person would like to be addressed with. And there's other kinds of markings that you can have on your body. In one LARP, we had a black dot on the badge that indicated not interested in romantic play. So these are the kinds of things that you can do. So these signaling systems are nonverbal, and they indicate what kinds of play are acceptable or off limits. So if I have a headband on, which I did for many years, playing a non-combat character, then that means don't attack me in character. But this was in a game that had boffer weapons, so it's very physically and viscerally realistic in the way that combat felt. Again, it could be a ribbon that says, I am interested in romantic play. So then somebody sees the ribbon and then they know they can approach with that kind of play. Now you still have to negotiate consent, and we'll talk about that later. And that can happen non-verbally sometimes, but I do recommend verbal negotiations just to make sure everybody's on the same page. But these ribbons or buttons or other markings are handy because if it's not there, players can avoid certain kinds of play, and if it's there, it can signal that they want certain kinds of play, or vice versa, depending on the system that you've set up. One thing that's really nice is if there's some sort of flexibility. So being able to change your mind during the course of play. Like I mentioned before, maybe somebody has really strong boundaries to start, and then as they move along, their boundaries shift, and maybe they're more open to certain kinds of play. So maybe they're able to put on a ribbon to say all of a sudden, yes, I am interested in romance, for example. So then there are calibration meta techniques, and these are ways for players to signal their needs and desires during the game as the play is happening. Now, calibration is not exactly the same thing as safety. Safety, for example, saying, please don't approach me with romance, that might be an actual safety issue. It might be extremely triggering for some reason for that person. Or it could just be a preference. And calibration kind of works for both, but it doesn't really matter why people have certain boundaries. The important thing is that we respect them. Calibration is great because it allows us to decide in the moment with each other what's going to happen next. And I particularly like games that have act breaks, and I'll tell you about that in a second. But one thing that you can do in calibration is consent negotiations. So when you ask for consent for something, you're basically asking, are you interested in playing for romance or sexuality or aggression? I've seen people, ask, hey, is anybody else interested in playing like a really antagonistic, angry scene with me? Another person was like, yeah, I would love that. And then they played it and it worked for them. I would not have wanted to play that scene. So, I didn't opt into that. So that's a form of calibration in the group. Consent negotiations can be taught formally during workshops, and I do recommend at least addressing how to negotiate consent during the workshops. I've put together with help of other designers consent negotiation scripts, and this can be a little complicated, and sometimes people don't remember all the parts, but it can be helpful to give people some language, like, would you be interested in, there's certain phrases that are sort of pre-worked so that they are invitational rather than pressuring. Or these negotiations can be more informally discussed, but either way, they should happen off game. meaning the player is asking the player. This might seem obvious, but sometimes in play it can be difficult. We don't want to break character. We don't want to break the scene for other people, or we're being asked a question that us as a player are not okay for, but us as a character are. And this is a very strange psychological state to be in. But being able to go completely off game and check in with the person, say, are you comfortable with this kind of scene progressing in this way, is really helpful because it gives them a chance to pause and really reflect on that question. The important part here is just to make sure that players agree with one another about what the established boundaries are and that no one feels pressured. So consent negotiation is not a legal binding document that, you know, I've achieved consent, so therefore I can do something to a person. It's not something that you try to extract from someone. It's something that you invite and you negotiate with respect for a no, if that comes up. So here's some techniques that can happen during play, which are actually during game. So for example, you can ask someone this meta technique called monologue, which means what is your character thinking right now? So let's say somebody's in the corner and they're playing very quietly and you're not sure if they're really engaged in the game or not. Maybe they're not sure how to insert themselves into a scene. Player or a facilitator can ask for a monologue in certain kinds of games. And this can often be good for shy or reticent or introverted players, or players who experience strong emotions, and it helps them to verbalize or participate. So when somebody calls for a monologue, the person says whatever is on their character's mind for the next minute or so until they're done. And then the players pretend that their characters have not heard this, but the players may use this information to steer in certain directions. And that can actually be really effective to get to more interesting scenes. There's also the spotlight. So shining GMs will do this often. What does your character want to do right now? Or what do you want to see happen in this game session? But it could be player initiated as well. So often, for example, if you're in a large scale LARP, you have a player group that you're with, and you're not actually having one-on-one conversations with any kind of facilitator. So it's good to ask within that group, what do each of you want from this game? Or what would you like to do now? What happens next? Sharing spotlight is a way for people to feel more safe and more included. And then, as I mentioned before, you can have act breaks, which allow for a short or a long pause in between scenes or for longer periods of play. So perhaps you're playing a short 2-hour freeform LARP where the act breaks are like 2 minutes long. They're not very long. That's still a pause where you can have these kinds of conversations about calibration. Or sometimes they're built in to be like 5 to 10 hours. It could be a very, very long act break where there's a lot of planning and debriefing and processing and calibration that's happening in between the acts. But either way, they can help participants steer towards the kind of play that each other want. So there are, during play, escalation techniques. So there's ways to signal escalation. We talked already about the enthusiastic thumbs up, like more of this. But there's ways to invite more intensity. So for example, I like the word harder, like I can handle more intensity, please go harder. There are thematic code phrases that you can build in to a statement. I find this a little bit harder to do because sometimes, no pun intended, sometimes it can be difficult to notice a phrase, a key phrase in a sentence. But I've heard, things like, it would be horrible if you continued to yell at me. That's something that somebody would likely not say in conversation, but it's a way to signal to the other player while still in character my character doesn't like this, but I really like it. Please keep going. There are also de-escalation techniques to request other players tone down the intensity. So there's softer, please speak more softly, slowly, less aggressively. I like to put my hands up like this, like softer. There's also the break, like let's put the brakes on this scene. And that doesn't mean that we're stopping the scene, we're just slowing it down, maybe lowering the intensity, maybe lowering the volume. You can decide within your group exactly what these things mean, but it's good to be specific. And then there's thematic code phrases, again, for that signal the opposite thing, that they want to de-escalate. Maybe the word is safety. I miss the safety of my home village, just kind of randomly in conversation. Obviously, it would need to be worked into the conversation to feel authentic, but it's one way to stay in game and indicate, hey, let's tone it down a little bit. There are also techniques to pause or completely stop play. So one can call cut, which means let's stop the scene for now. Anyone can call cut for any reason and play stops. You may see in certain scenes that are highly facilitated by a game master, they may just call cut to end the scene, or a player might call cut because they need to have a kind of conversation about something, or they just maybe need to stop for whatever reason. Now, again, an individual could use something like the look down to just leave the scene if they just want to opt out of that scene, but cut stops play for everyone. And there may or may not be a discussion about why cut was called. Sometimes cut is called because there's a safety concern in terms of the physical environment, like there's broken glass everywhere all of a sudden, or someone lost their glasses, or it could be that someone's just not comfortable with the direction the scene is going. And the group may or may not resume play afterward, depending on the needs of the players. So it may be a very short thing. Oh, I found my glasses. Now we can resume the game. Or it may be something that can't be resolved, like the direction this game went just isn't comfortable. So let's instead maybe have a debriefing conversation about it. And that concludes part 3 of our series on safety and role-playing games. Our next video will be about strategies that you can employ after your game in order to help with processing and integration to maximize the potential for transformation for your players.